turn out okay, and hopefully everyone can hear us.
Fingers crossed.
We have no picture right now because I'm still terrible at looking Discord. I mean, not Discord, OBS. But, so, first of all, introduce my guest again.
Hello.
What do you do again?
Well, I'm a stay-at-home parent and freelance writer. But I'm also an amateur historian. So that is how I am relevant today.
Last time she was here, we were talking about all the amendments to the Constitution. But today, we're going to go a little bit further back and see how it originally came about.
I just found in the National Archive website store a book depressingly titled OMG WTF Does the Constitution Actually Say? A non-boring guide to our democracy, to how our democracy is supposed to work. And I hope to give you information in a less appallingly cringe way than that.
We can only hope. Alright, so let's talk how it began. What's the preamble all about?
Well, the preamble is basically, what are we even trying to do here? Because the thing to remember about the Constitution is, technically they weren't supposed to write it. That was...
Yeah. Articles of Confederation.
Right. They were there not to write a constitution, but to reform the Articles of Confederation. And basically everyone who was there went into it with the knowledge that the Articles of Confederation were hopelessly broken. They could not be fixed in a way that would create a viable country moving forward. Congress had no authority. There's a whole thing about George Washington wasn't the first president. You know, this other person was, but their title was basically President of Congress.
And the Congress had no power whatsoever.
Right. There was no chief executive. Congress existed, but they couldn't pass national laws, in no small part because they had no authority to tax literally anything. They were completely reliant on, essentially, donations from the states. And because every single state had veto power. So, and apparently this was the biggest problem, if Rhode Island was feeling put out that day, because nobody was taking them seriously because they are too small, they could just prevent anything from happening and keep any laws from being passed. And there are some broken things with how laws get passed under our current system of government, but it's still better than that. So what the preamble is basically justifying what they're doing. It's saying, okay, this isn't what we were here for, but in order to, keep our country going, we have created this constitution instead. It has no power under law, because, there's no law there. It's just a list of goals. But it is seen as one of the important founding statements of our country, as these are the goals of the United States, and this is what we want to be doing as a nation. What promote the general welfare means, for example, varies quite a lot from person to person. which posterity we're securing blessings of liberty for, things like that. But as a statement of ideals, it's pretty good.
Yeah. Uh, okay. Article 1, what we call the Congress, or legislative branch.
Yeah. This was based roughly around the British Parliament. But I'm going to preface everything I say with, there is no such thing as the Founding Fathers wanted. Because that assumes a degree of unanimity that does not exist, if you look at their writings.
Like, you mean we weren't an all-together Christian nation back in the day?
Oh, man. I tend to sum it up as, if Alexander Hamilton had said the sky was blue, 3 guys would have checked the window. Because there was so much conflict. And yes, some of it was religious. I like to tell the story of the, I think I told this last time, of the congregation of Baptists who agreed that they wanted to vote for Thomas Jefferson and not John Adams because they believed that Thomas Jefferson was an atheist, but an atheist would do less harm to them than an Episcopalian. So there was the obvious religious issues. I think there were still some states that had laws on their books, like forbidding Catholics, things like that. But also
a holdover from our Church of England days.
Yeah. Oh yeah. No. If you look at the old laws of the Massachusetts colony, they are super strict because it wasn't that just you had to be Christian, you had to be one very specific kind of Christian. And Pennsylvania mostly exists because nobody liked Quakers. And Maryland exists because nobody liked Catholics. And, Rhode Island exists because the rest of the people had to go somewhere.
He wanted to... I think I remember. I could be wrong about history, but I think he actually wanted to pay the Native Americans for their land.
Yeah, and that was not a popular choice. So then of course you get into the regional conflicts. North versus South, obviously. But even, New England versus New York and Pennsylvania, which were much more commerce-oriented. New England was still relatively agricultural in those days. And so there was the conflict of agrarian versus business. And all sorts of conflicts like that. So when I say the Founding Fathers said or wanted or anything like that, remember that I am speaking in generalities. And I myself can probably name at least 3 or 4 Founding Fathers who wanted something completely different. My most interesting example is that Alexander Hamilton wanted to abolish state lines.
Like this, no states, just one country.
No states, just one country. And that's an admirable goal, but not really feasible, especially in the days where communication and travel took as long as they did. It is a lot easier for me to understand the needs of a Floridian, and I'm in Washington State, than it would be in those days for someone from New Hampshire to understand the needs of someone from Vermont. Just because I have a lot more access to what's going on in Florida.
And back then, each of state thought themselves as their own country almost.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. It's generally believed that one of the most interesting changes brought to the United States in the Civil War was a grammatical one, where the United States stopped being plural and started being singular. The U.S. is and the U.S. are is the big difference that the Civil War brought as far as the broader political, the patriotic change, as it were. Robert E. Lee thought of himself as a Virginian first and an American second. So, yeah, these people still thought of themselves as North Carolinians, South Carolinians, Georgians. I don't remember the adjective form for New Jersey, but, very much they're of this state, and this state is part of this looser organization of states. So there's a lot of conflict, and as we go through this, you'll see where the biggest fights were, because that's where the language is the most detailed. Because when they really, really disagreed, they went out of their way to hammer out a compromise that, if it didn't make everybody happy, at least made everyone the same degree of unhappy. So you get, we're about to hit the 3/5 compromise. And there's a lot going on there. But that was one of those things that if they hadn't come up with a compromise, there would not have been a country. So,
first section 1, it says a Senate and a House.
Yeah, and that is basically based off the British Parliament.
House of Lords, House of Commons.
House of Lords, House of Commons. This is what I was starting to say, is the Founding Fathers didn't want a House of Lords. And again, let's go with most of them. Because there were a few who were very big on the idea of an American aristocracy. An American hereditary aristocracy. But mostly, it was just kind of assumed that there would be a de facto one without giving anybody titles. And that's why the Senate has certain privileges over the House, because it was assumed that the Senate would be our type of people. The wealthy, landed, essentially American gentry. And the House of Representatives, shorter term, less power in as much as there's more of them, so it's more spread out. The equivalent of Commons. And obviously, it wouldn't be peasants. But, a wealthy storekeeper would qualify.
Yeah, I think even at first, even all white men couldn't vote. Only white landowning men could vote.
Yeah. And again, that's one of those ones that varies based on where you are, because the voting requirements were obviously state by state. But it was very much assumed that everybody who voted would have a certain amount of money. And U.S. history can kind of be seen as a history of expanding the franchise. So first it was white male landowners, and then it was all white men. And then it was, I guess black people can vote too.
Only black men.
And then, yeah, but they have to be men. And then, I guess women could vote too. And then, I guess we meant it when we said black people could vote.
And then finally, let's lower it down a few years.
Yeah. I guess if you're old enough to be drafted, you're old enough to vote. So, the House of Representatives was always seen as a lesser house, like the House of Commons, and the Senate was always seen as the upper house, like the House of Lords.
Yeah, like you could become a representative all the way at 25 years old.
Yeah. Oh yeah. My firstborn is old enough to be a representative now, which is a little alarming to me. but will not be eligible to be president for another 10 years.
Can you run for president?
And if you'll note here, representatives also only have to be citizens for 7 years.
So that and unlike the president we'll talk about later, they don't have to be born in the country.
Yeah. And we will get into how vague the citizenship requirement for president is. But with representatives, 7 years a citizen. And you have to be an inhabitant of the state in which you are chosen, which historically, the actual requirements for what counts as an inhabitant are a little unenforced. People using their friends' addresses and buying houses they never actually live in and so forth, to qualify as living in that state. But officially and technically, you do have to live in the state you are a representative of, which is reasonable.
Right? Yeah, I'd hope you. I would hope you live in the state you're representing. Like I'm representing Washington and I live in Florida.
Yeah, it's not just because I have a better shot at understanding the needs of Florida these days doesn't mean I'm as affected by laws governing Florida as I would be if I actually lived there. Thank God. And then we get into the 3/5 compromise.
Yes. That was just
And I'm going to read this one out loud because it deserves to be read in its entirety just for... There's a lot going on in this sentence. Representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included within this union, according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to a service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons. So, indentured servants, which were still sort of technically a thing at the time, counted for representation. It's really important to note that most indentured servants were white, because that's an important distinction between indentured servants and full-on slaves. Or, sorry, all other persons. The word slave does not appear in the Constitution. And the main reason for that was that the southern states were really big and really powerful. It is no longer true that more presidents have been from Virginia than any other state. But 4 of our first 5 presidents were from Virginia.
See, Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe.
Yep. And the only remaining one was John Adams from Massachusetts. So if you look at the number of representatives, which comes up as what the original representatives were, Massachusetts gets 8. Virginia gets 10. Each of the Carolinas get 5. New York gets 6 and Pennsylvania gets 8. But Maryland gets 6, Virginia gets 10, the Carolinas each get 5, and Georgia gets 3. And most of the northern states get fewer than the Carolinas.
So you had a lot more people living in the South at the time?
A lot more people living in the South. And that would change as the United States industrialized and urbanized. But we were still, in 1789, a very agrarian nation. And that also meant that not just the population, but the wealth was still heavily concentrated in the South.
This is even before the cotton gin became a thing. So this is mostly tobacco. I think mostly tobacco stuff.
Tobacco, rice, indigo. Those were really the big three at the time. Cotton was starting to become a thing, but it was so expensive to produce. And that's partially because of the seeds are really sticky and don't want to leave the cotton boll. And that is what the cotton gin does. It gets the seeds out of the cotton. And also, I'm not an expert on cotton, but if you study the Civil War, you have to learn at least a little bit. But there's two types of cotton as far as length of fiber. And we wanted the kind with the longer fibers because, I mean, obviously that's easier to work with. But I believe that is the kind with the worst seeds to deal with.
Gaining and loss, like it's better fiber, but worse seeds.
Yeah. So, it's generally agreed that if the cotton gin hadn't been invented, it actually was possible for slavery to have died out simply because the slave system was incredibly inefficient. But cotton needs a lot of manual labor.
Yeah.
And by all accounts, it is extremely brutal manual labor.
I think the only thing worse than cotton back in the day was sugar.
Yeah, and sugar does not grow well in the contiguous United States. Some in, Florida, but it's worth noting that the only U.S. state that's ever been a major sugar producer is Hawaii.
I think they had more slaves in the Caribbean and the South American countries than they did up north.
Oh, absolutely. Slavery in Brazil is an incredibly horrifying topic. There's a lot going on in Brazilian slavery. And in the Caribbean, where you'd get the islands producing sugar, and, it was very, very clear in the sugar-producing areas that you needed the manual labor. And it was very clear once cotton became a thing that you needed the manual labor. And actually, rice, what they needed was not entirely the labor so much as the knowledge. The slaves that were really in demand in regions that produce rice were ones from parts of Africa where rice is grown. And so they brought them to the United States because they knew what they were doing, and the plantation owners did not. But, at the time, things were still so agricultural that they needed the South in order to hold the country together. And the fact that it is very specifically 3/5, I think tells you a lot about that, because it's not half. It's slightly more than half. Because the South was able to get that little tiny edge. And the important thing about the 3/5 is about representation. The Southerners wanted slaves to count as whole people for the purposes of representation.
Not for taxes.
But not for taxes. They wanted to be property for taxes and whole people for representation. And the Northerners was like, no, I don't think so. You have to pick one of those. And what they were able to hammer out was the Three-Fifths Compromise, and a lot of people at the time were unhappy with it, in one direction or the other. Obviously, the major slave owners mostly were like, no, but property when it counts and population when it counts. And a lot of the Northerners flat out thought that slaves should count as property. Because if you treat them as property, then they're property, which is not great, but also kind of true. But in order to get really mostly the Carolinas and Virginia into the Union, a compromise had to be reached. Because just abolishing slavery was not going to happen in 1789. The political will was not there anywhere.
I don't think that it was even major abolitionists at the time either, probably.
Some. What I've long found interesting is, and I can't remember exactly who it was, and I don't remember what book I read it in, but I read a book about the Constitutional Convention a while back that pointed out that the longest and most passionate speech given about the moral evils of slavery at the convention was also given by its largest slaveholder. This is someone who owned 300 plus human beings as his personal property and knew that it was evil, and said in his speech that allowing it to be one of the cornerstones of this country was starting the country off on the wrong foot and would only lead to horrible things. Did he free his slaves? He did not. Ben Franklin, who was at the convention, one of the only people who was at both the Constitutional Convention and the Declaration of Independence, founded an abolition society. Alexander Hamilton was an abolitionist. There were a few abolitionists in the Constitutional Convention, but most Northerners, the most that they wanted was, don't spread it. Limit it to where it is now, and don't bring in more slaves.
And that goes to after 20 years, no more slave trade.
Yeah. And it's worth noting that is purely the importation of slaves that is banned.
Not breeding.
Not breeding, not buying and selling ones that are already in the country. You just can't bring in more. And let's be real, part of that was pure racism. Part of that was we don't want any more black people in the country than we already have. But part of it was also the idea that maybe we can end it simply by ending the source. Because I don't think most people anticipated how cutthroat literal breeding would be in years to come.
As I was saying before, the southern United States had the least amount of slaves imported, unlike because unlike the I would say this is even I would say it's as bad, but unlike the Seger ones, we didn't have the highest death overthrow as the Seger people.
Yeah. Oh yeah, no, the death toll again in Brazil was shocking. It wasn't great in the United States, and God knows, the Passage had a horrifying death toll. But as far as once you got to the Americas, anywhere was better than Brazil. Nowhere was great. Anywhere was better than Brazil.
Because you're still a slave.
Yeah.
Okay, and then next, talking about, they'll have a speaker.
Mm-hmm.
And impeachment power.
Yeah. And this is another one where it was clear that everybody agreed that those should happen, and let's move on. Because there's not a lot of detail here. The House of Representatives shall choose their speaker and other officers. How? What officers will those be? They'll figure it out.
And if you've seen my video with RJ, we talked about the 4 or 5 presidential impeachments we've had so far, and how they did it. All House members. All right, Section 3. The Senate.
Yeah, and this is the first part of the Constitution. I mean, leaving aside things like, giving more people rights. But the first section of the Constitution where the actual laws have been changed. Because you'll note, chosen by the legislature thereof. Because
pick the U.S. Senate until recently.
Yeah, that's I believe that's a 20th century amendment. Either way, it went more than 100 years where the state legislatures chose senators. And that was partially because the state legislatures were also assumed to be gentlemen, and senators were too important to be trusted to the commoners.
Like you said, they were more of an upper class at the time.
Exactly. And this is, we get into, and then we rotate every 6 years, but they're offset from one another, so you get different Senate elections every 2 years. And for senator, you have to be 30 and 9 years a citizen. And an inhabitant of your state.
But this time, only 2 per state in that population.
And that's another compromise. I forget how many representatives we would now have if we kept to the initial number of representatives that one for every 30,000 people. I forget how many representatives we would end up with now, but it's a lot.
Yeah,
way more than we currently have.
Yeah, I've heard that we should at least modify it a little bit because we have very, very high dispersions of people.
Yeah, basically the Senate or the House of Representatives would have to meet in an arena if we kept up with the number we had at the time.
Was it now a million people for every representative now or something?
Something, depending on what state you're in, because there's also a minimum. You have to have at least one representative per state.
Now for senators, I think this was another compromise where they wanted the smaller states wanted equal population. The bigger states were like, no, population, all population.
Yeah. And some of those smaller states were also, it was basically the most of the founding fathers knew that this was an all or nothing situation. Either all the states joined or the country wasn't going to work. So there are a lot of things in here that people are like, why do they do it this way? Well, because they had to. Because the power of the small states versus the power of the big states was an important consideration. Like I said, under the Articles of Confederation, Rhode Island did a lot just because they could. And they did not want to give up all the power that they had under the Articles of Confederation. So having 2 senators per state, regardless of population, is basically let's appease Rhode Island and Delaware. New Hampshire a little bit, but mostly it's about Rhode Island and Delaware. And there's a lot of language in Section 3 that makes it very clear that these are the people that they assume will have more power. And more influence, and just be more important. And, a lot of the history of the U.S., that has historically been true.
So why do they? I think we talked about a little bit in the amendment. Why they change it from having the state government appoint them to having elections?
Well, it's partially that whole expansion of franchisement thing. The current stance of the U.S. is to trust the will of the people more than the founding fathers generally did. Generally speaking, the founding fathers wanted to limit power in as few hands as possible, specifically theirs. And if you weren't elite enough to meet with them, then you weren't important enough for your opinion about the country to really matter. And we have mostly moved away from that. And a lot more into the average person should have more of a say. And also, it's a lot easier to gerrymander a state house than it is to gerrymander a state. So you can have a state that, because of districting lines, votes Republican as hell, but the majority of the population of the state would actually vote for a Democratic senator. And so there is at least that level of, okay, it's the debate about does land vote, do people vote, depends a lot. And in the case of senator, people vote within the state because everybody within the state has the same amount of control about who the senator is going to be. Except for the people who can afford to, run for senator.
And then we come to the next one where it shows the VP's only power that we know of at the time at least.
Yeah. Tiebreaker. I mean, tiebreaker is important.
How often does the vice president actually over the Senate?
Depends on the vice president. Some of them go sit over the Senate because they don't have anything better to do. Some of them don't have anything better to do, and that's the way they like it. Some of them actually work hand in hand with their president and are off doing things for the president and don't have the time to sit and hold the Senate's hand during times when everybody knows how everything's going to go anyway.
Which is why we have the president pro tempore.
Yeah, president pro tempore. John Nance Garner, who was FDR's first vice president, referred to the presidency in the clean version as not being worth a pitcher of warm spit. There's another 4-letter fluid that sometimes is quoted as being, but generally it's accepted as having been spit and not piss. And he mostly just went back to Texas, for what I can tell. Like, you're not giving me anything to do. I don't have any power in the Senate. I'm just gonna go back home and hang out with my friends.
Who said that again?
That's John Nance Garner.
Oh.
Which is FDR's first vice president, also known as Cactus Jack.
I was you're talking about Lyndon Johnson for a second.
Yeah, I mean, they were certainly similar men in several notable ways. But yeah.
I find funny, ironic. We talked about how the Senate is the senators are the upper house, but at least in current times, the Speaker of the House is higher the order of presidency than the President pro tem
Yeah.
is.
Well, I mean, at the time that the Constitution was actually written, they didn't have an order of succession. Like, as you may recall, we took quite a few amendments in before they finally went, oh yeah, and I guess the vice president should be in charge if something happens to the president.
Yeah, for a while it was just assumed, like, oh, the president's like,
Yeah.
I'm in charge now.
Yeah.
Like, okay, whatever.
Yeah, but these days, the Speaker of the House, and I think that's because there's a lot more room for negotiation in the House. Which means the Speaker actually has more control because the House is bigger and because there's a lot more possibility of horse trading. I will vote for you on this thing if you vote for me on this other thing. Less so these days than historically, but still, a thing. And I mean, the vice president, as president of the Senate, is ahead of the Speaker of the House. The president pro tem is right under that, so.
How do they pick the president pro tem? Is election or other?
It's an election.
Okay.
Yeah. I believe the president pro tem is of the house, of the party that controls the Senate. Just assumed, even if that's not the same as the vice president. But yeah, it's like the Speaker of the House, which we all saw in exhaustive detail how they choose a Speaker of the House.
But
slowly and agonizingly over dozens of elections.
But the president pro tem can't break it.
No, no,
because he's a part of the 100.
Yeah, he is one of the 100. And if it's split exactly 50-50, the vice president comes in and makes a big fuss and gets to vote and bangs a gavel and then goes home again. And it doesn't happen very often.
So his rare power is very rarely used.
Yes. Well, these days her, but yes.
Oh, I just thought of something funny. Like, never mind. He was the president. That wouldn't count. I was thinking of something, but if a presidential impeachment and the vice president's a tiebreaker.
I mean, there have been vice presidents who would have voted against their president. It's worth noting here, on the subject of impeachments, that it is just to an impeachment is not removal from office. An impeachment is basically the equivalent of an indictment. And the House of Representatives issues the impeachment and votes on it and says yay or nay, and then it goes to the Senate, who holds a trial. And there have been 4 impeachments. There has never been a successful vote in the Senate to remove the president from office. I believe there have been other officials who have been removed from office, but no president. Even the one who had 2 tries at it.
Was our next thing? How the Senate that's a trial.
Yeah. What goes before the Senate is a trial, and as it says in the Constitution, the only punishment they are allowed to give is removal from office and disqualification to hold other office. But it also specifically says in the Constitution that, and double jeopardy was not yet officially legal because that's in the Bill of Rights, but they will be liable to further punishment by law for the same offense. So if you were impeached for, let's throw out inciting insurrection as a possibility, and removed from office for inciting insurrection, you could still go on trial for treason and sedition and still suffer whatever legal consequences came from that, even though you had been tried in the Senate and found guilty. It is not considered the same thing.
Is that all for Section 3?
That's all for Section 3.
Alright. Number 4.
The Senate, the Congress should meet sometimes.
So
basically is what Section 4 says.
We might as well get together sometime, and discuss some laws and stuff,
Yeah. And I believe that the first Monday in November is one of the ones. Yeah, that's Amendment 11 changed. Or hold on, let me follow my own link here. Oh, you're not going to actually. Great. But National Archive site is not giving me a direct link to the amendment that changed that. But that was changed by amendment. It does not have to be the first Monday in December. It is now a different day that they have to meet. But they have to meet at least... Oh, yeah, there we go. 20. They have to meet at least once a year, and such meeting shall begin at noon on the third day of January. Now, unless they decide that doesn't work for them. Unless they shall, by law, appoint a different day. But they have to meet at least one day a year. What day it is in the Constitution, unless they decide that day doesn't work for them, somebody's got a brunch scheduled, and then they vote for a different day. That's Section 4.
Nice. Alright. Number 5, then.
5 is the very, very basics of how they actually work. The George Santos thing is kind of being held up by Article 1, Section 5 right now. Because the only people who can decide if he's qualified is the House of Representatives. And with a Republican majority, then George Santos is staying. They need to have a majority of the House in order to do business.
Is he the one... I might be wrong. Is he the one going to war with Walt Disney World?
No, that's DeSantis.
Okay.
Yeah, no, that's the governor of Florida. George Santos feels like he should be from Florida, but well, honestly, nobody quite knows where he's from. But he represents New York. He's the one who has consistently and bewilderingly lied about every single aspect of his life. My favorite of his lies is that he claims to have been one of the producers on the Spider-Man musical.
Is that a good thing he's bragging about, or a bad thing?
I mean, the Spider-Man musical is one of the most infamous flops in Broadway history. Or as I told a friend the other day, they mostly closed it so that it would not actually end with a death count.
Yeah. Why he wanted to brag about it, I don't know.
Yeah, it's like, I mean, you're a weird flex, but okay. But they can't, each house can punish its members for disorderly behavior. If 2/3 of the house agrees, they can expel a member. They have to keep a journal and publish it. They have to enter the vote into the record, and they can't adjourn for more than 3 days without the other house agreeing that that's okay. So basically, this is the bare bones, this is how Congress is actually going to do its job. Section 6 is they should be paid. And they can't be arrested while actually doing their job. And then there's the emoluments clause. No senator or representative shall, during the time for which he was elected, be appointed to any civil office under the authority of the United States, which shall have been created, or the emoluments whereof shall have been increased during such time, and no person holding any office under the United States shall be a member of either house during his continuance in office. This one is basically, you can't have two jobs. You can't be, a senator and a postmaster. You can't be, a representative and a current head of the CIA or what have you. You can only do one of those two things at a time.
So you're saying after I get elected to the Senate, I have to quit my job at McDonald's?
No! Because that's not a civil office under the authority of the United States.
I'm gonna quit it. I'm gonna quit it anyways.
I mean, certainly the Senate pays better. And most of the time is less dangerous.
Except for the time when that one guy caned you to death.
Yeah. Oh, well, it wasn't to death. It was almost to death, but it wasn't to death. And they named a town in Washington after him.
The caner or the canee?
The canee, who was an abolitionist. Sumner, Washington is named after the guy who was beaten to death for being beaten half to death for being rude about slavery in Congress. The speech is a lot, by the way. It may contain the word whoremaster. So, highly recommend seeking out and reading that one if you can.
But basically, they get paid for working the Senate, working House.
They get paid for working the Senate. They can't be arrested except for treason, felony, and breach of the peace. So I guess murder, because that's a felony. But they can't be arrested literally on the Senate floor for parking tickets.
This guy sped 25 in the 20 zone. Kick him out. Kick him out.
I mean, technically, the requirements for impeachment are so vague that theoretically you could be removed from office for speeding. I think it would take a lot to get the will of Congress behind that, but it's technically possible.
Unless it was like that Tennessee Congress where they kicked somebody out for protesting.
Oh, yeah, well, state houses, what are you gonna do?
Yeah, that's a whole other can of worm episode.
Yeah, well, and because it's so varied by state.
True.
Some states actually don't have two houses to their legislature. And, yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot.
Yeah, I bet a lot of people don't even know who their state representatives are, probably.
I know mine. Because I'm the person who looks all this stuff up for my friends at election time. But, I think most people don't even know who their member of the House of Representatives is. I will say, actually, I'm one of a handful of people in the United States who has 2 female senators and a female representative.
in the
So,
in the U.S. Congress.
in the US Congress, all three of my Congress critters are women.
And what about your state your state capital one?
I mean, Washington kind of does them weird, so I've got different, but I have male representatives there. Um, but on a federal level, three women, one of whom is actually a woman of color. So,
Yeah, no, you're talking about like only one job in civil office, right?
yeah, yeah. And I think actually under this you would technically be able to be both a U.S. senator and a state senator, because I think it is purely at the federal level that this is enforced.
Like
Yeah, under the authority of the United States.
wow, that'd be really double dipping. Like I gotta go real fast. Go for my state. Go back.
Yeah.
Go back to the country.
I, I'm sorry, I've got to leave Washington, D.C. and go to Albany.
Well, I guess so. Planes would be a lot faster now than back in the horseless carriage days or the train days.
Well, yeah, I mean, the Constitution was just horse carriage. Not horseless, even. Yeah, I forget how long it took George Washington to get from Mount Vernon to Philadelphia, but it was not a short trip.
Yeah, because this is even before Washington D.C. time.
Yeah, yeah. I believe the first president to actually live in Washington, D.C. was Adams, who hated it.
I think it'd be funny if Washington, because he probably lives a lot closer to Washington. Virginia's a lot closer to Washington D.C. than it is to Philadelphia.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. And then they moved to New York, which is also not close.
Oh, next thing, the House gets to start money bills.
Yes. But the Senate has to approve them. I believe that is also originally from Parliament, but my knowledge of Parliament is shaky. But this is a lot of how bills get passed and veto power and so forth. Including the pocket veto.
If I remember it, the most I know about most of my vetoed bill knowledge comes from the 70s cartoon.
I mean, the 70s cartoon is not a bad simplification of Section 7 of Article 1. It's clear, it's concise, this is how laws get made.
And it rhymes.
And it rhymes. And now it's stuck in my head. But this also makes it clear that who votes how is a matter of public record.
Especially now since it's televised.
Yeah, well.
With the... Have you ever actually watched the C-SPAN channels?
Oh, I mean, first off, when I watch the conventions, I only watch it on C-SPAN because all I want is just to watch the convention, not to listen to talking heads.
True.
But I also watched quite a lot of it on January 6th of 2 years ago. Because, wow, there was a lot going on C-SPAN that day. The thing is watching any job is kind of boring, honestly, if you're watching the whole thing.
Yeah, I see this.
But most of what really influences what laws get passed is not done on the floor of Congress. It's done in people's offices.
Behind the scenes.
Behind the scenes. It's a lot of lobbyists, but even leaving aside the lobbyists, it's a lot of, people having conversations, people making deals, people quietly reading. That's gripping television. The quietly reading part. Because you'd hope that these people would actually read at least some of the text of these bills.
Yeah, the mostly we see on TV, I think, was this guy votes for this guy votes for that.
Yeah. And that's important, but, the whole of what goes into making a law is not ever going to be broadcast. And even if it were, again, a lot of it just flatly wouldn't be interesting.
So,
Somebody's got to do the typing. And, hopefully most of the people have read at least some of the text and not must-see TV.
so basically, writing down, two-thirds of both things need to vote for it. If it's money, if it's money, it starts with the House. If anything else starts with the Senate. Does it matter?
Well, most laws are simple majorities, but for money, it's got to be 2/3. Which is part of where things are complicated right now. Because they do have to get a supermajority to pass to raise the debt ceiling. And the Republicans have decided that this is a hill they're going to die on. Which is going to shoot them in the foot because so much of their base draws government checks. But 2/3 has to pass to raise the debt ceiling. So they've got to get not just every single Democrat, but a substantial percentage of Republicans on board with raising the debt ceiling.
And then the president says yay or nay, I like it, or hell no, and then it goes back to the Senate and back to them that they can override it. It becomes a law no matter what.
Yep. Very seldom is a presidential veto overridden. It happens, but it doesn't happen a lot. And you can tell a lot about a president by looking at the number of overridden vetoes he has. And that is all stuff that is possible to find.
And then we go to the actual powers of the Congress.
The actual powers of the Congress. And what falls under these has been a matter of debate since 1789. Some of it is really obvious. But we get back into, well, what is the common defense and general welfare? To provide for the punishment of counterfeiting the securities in current coin in the United States. Obviously, okay, Congress decides what the penalty for counterfeiting is. But what is promoting the progress of science and useful arts by securing, for limited times, to authors and inventors the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries? That's copyright and patent law.
So are post roads what the post office drives on?
Post roads are toll roads, basically. They are, generally speaking, though, in more recent years, the federal highway system has been decided to be part of post roads because there is that, it holds the country together and it's, common defense, general welfare.
That makes much more sense. I'm like, it says it's out with post office and post roads. I'm like, are they connected or something? Are these the roads that the post office people have to drive on? They're delivering mail.
I mean, technically, every road in the United States is a post road because it is federal law that the United States Post Office has to serve every single address in the United States. Which is one of the reasons the post office is a more encompassing service than UPS or FedEx. But yeah, officially, a post road is a road designated for the transportation of postal mail, but in the United States, that is just literally all of them.
And the Congress can declare war.
Congress can declare war. Only Congress can declare war. Now, Lyndon Johnson figured him out some ways around that, but legally and officially, only Congress can declare war.
So I guess technicality, were we at war with these countries or just invading them without the approval of Congress?
Yeah, formally they were police actions.
Let's send the police then.
That is a recurring joke on MASH, yes. Because the Korean War was not a declared war. It was a police action. Likewise, Vietnam. That got really dicey really fast. I do love that you can tell how different our country is now from when the Constitution was written, that some of Congress's powers include granting letters of marque and reprisal, which is basically establishing privateers, and to define it.
That's like legal pirates, right? Pirates.
Yeah, privateers are legal pirates. They are pirates in the employ of a government, who basically attack the ships of a specific list of countries. Traditionally speaking, it's the English attacking the Spanish. It's privateers. But also to define and punish piracies and felonies committed on the high seas.
You work for us, you work against us.
Mm-hmm. An interesting one that probably will be changed by constitutional amendment in my lifetime. To exercise exclusive legislation in all cases whatsoever over such district not exceeding 10 miles square as may, by cession of the particular states and the acceptance of Congress, become the seat of government of the United States, and to exercise like authority over all places purchased by the consent of the legislature of the state in which the same shall be, for the erection of forts, magazines, arsenals, dockyards, and other needful buildings. That establishes Washington, D.C. And I believe that in my lifetime, there will be an amendment that will take authority of Washington, D.C. away from Congress. That seems to be the direction things are going there.
And finally, to make laws, necessary execution of foreign powers. Foregoing powers.
Yeah.
I said only the Congress can execute foreign people.
No. No, but basically it's saying any law that Congress needs in order to execute these powers, they have the authority to pass. Also, and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or any department or officer thereof gets into prohibition because the amendment gave Congress the power to pass legislation to enforce prohibition. So that would have fallen under Article 1, Section 8.
You know, I forgot how long how big the legislative branch was in powers.
Yeah, well, and again, part of that is because they fought about this a lot. I mean, you compare this to Article 3.
The judicial one?
Yeah, no, yeah, the judicial one, which is just bitty. And, you know, Article 5, which is, and then we can amend things. Those are the ones where everyone's like, yes, that's a good idea. You know, I sum up the legislative as, ooh, Supreme Court, we should have one of those. And that's pretty much all the Constitution says. But these guys fought for weeks about exactly what the legislative branch was going to look like and exactly what the executive branch was going to look like. And so it is so detailed because they wanted to make sure that nobody took an inch more power than they were given. These were men, again, mostly, terrified of tyranny.
And these also to make sure we didn't keep the same mistakes we had with the Articles of Confederation, too, probably.
Right. So you wanted to give Congress and the executive enough authority to accomplish literally anything, but not so much that they would become tyrants. And so it's more compromise. Basically, anytime you want to know why something in the Constitution looks the way it does, it's almost certainly a compromise between two factions.
Number 9.
Yeah.
About the slave trade.
The migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit shall not be prohibited by the Congress prior to the year 1808, but a tax or duty may be imposed on such importation not exceeding $10 for each person. And if you didn't know what that was about, you wouldn't know what that was about.
Was basically saying after 1808, no more slaves can be imported.
And before then, they can be taxed, but not more than $10 a person.
Okay, and that's $10 back then, not $10 now.
That is $10 back then, and if you'll give me just a second here, I have bookmarked on my computer like a smart person a site called the Inflation Calculator. So $10 in 1789. They won't let me do it. We'll go with 1808. That's because 1789 is before they will let me do it. 187.63.
Only $100?
Almost 2. But yeah. That is still very little money. And that is the most tax they were allowed. What's worth noting is that for quite a lot of U.S. history, Congress has not really had much tax money to work with. It wasn't until the establishment of the income tax that Congress actually had any kind of real serious budget to work with by modern standards. They could pass tariffs, they could tax, what was our phrasing again? Such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit. But they are not allowed to tax very much, and they're not allowed to pass direct taxes, and yeah. Less than $200 a person in today's money.
Yeah. And also talks about taxes too, because the old Congress couldn't tax anything unless the state approved.
Yeah.
All 13 states approved.
Recall the Articles of Confederation flatly prevented Congress from levying any taxes.
Like you think it's hard enough to get 2/3 to agree on something. All 13 states at the time.
All 13 states had to agree on everything. And none of the representatives from that state just had to be in a pissy mood. Because if you're having a bad day, sure, screw up the entire country. Because you can. Articles of Confederation are worthless.
Oh, and finally, last thing is no nobility here in America.
Yeah. No title of nobility shall be granted by the United States, and no person holding any office or profit office of profit or trust under them shall, without the consent of the Congress, except if any present emolument, office, or title of any kind whatever from any king, prince, or foreign state. Which means not only does the United States not have nobility, but if you are an American citizen, you have to get Congress's permission to accept a title from another country.
Like to be knighted or something.
Yeah. If Charles III wanted to knight me, which I can't see that he would, but let's go with it, I would actually have to get permission from Congress to accept the knighthood. And technically, that is not even just a title. That is, if I wanted to get an official government job from another. Now, in practical terms, I got a quasi-sister-in-law in Sweden, and I'm sure the U.S. does not care if she got a job working for the Swedish government. I believe she works for the American Embassy, but she could, if she wanted to, work for the Swedish government and no one would care. But technically, she has to have U.S. government permission. And then basically Section 10 is states don't get to do any of this nonsense either. The states have to work together, is basically what Section 10 is.
They have to work together?
Yeah. All such laws shall be subject to the revision and control, with a U, because 1789, of the Congress. No state
Sorry, go on.
No state shall, without the consent of Congress, lay any duty of tonnage, keep troops or ships of war in time of peace, enter into any agreement or compact with another state or with a foreign power, or engage in war unless actually invaded or in such imminent danger as will not admit of delay.
So basically that's the ongoing battle between state power and the federal power?
Yeah. And, I'd have to look it up to be sure, but I'm pretty sure that Section 10 is what Lincoln was drawing on in 1861 when he sent troops into the South. It's like, no, you don't get to just back out. You signed up to be part of this, and you have to work with us.
Like imagine if every state could leave like an election.
Right, exactly. So,
why they left them.
Lincoln's not playing with that.
We don't like who became president. Let's leave.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of president,
Article 2, which I'm reading off the National Archives, and anything that has been altered by a later amendment on the National Archives is in blue text, and so much of Section 1 of Article 2 is in blue text, because so much of this has changed. But, Sentence 1, the executive power shall be vested in a President of the United States of America. And that alone took so much fighting. Because there were a couple of people who were kind of holding out for an American king. And there were some people who wanted a tribunal. Basically, they wanted 3 people in charge. And there were people who wanted life, a term of life, and there were some people who wanted 5 years, and there were some people who wanted 10, and some people who wanted 1, and can you imagine the chaos that would have been? And just, that is, again, so detailed through here, because so much fighting.
So that's what we got. 2 for reps, 4 for president, and 6 for senate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Compromise. And you can tell that they expected senators to be more powerful than the president because the term for senator is longer.
I guess depending.
And this is establishing the Electoral College. Each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors equal to the whole number of senators and representatives to which the state may be entitled in the Congress, but no senator or representative or person holding an office of trust or profit under the United States shall be appointed an elector. Which means Postmaster General cannot be an elector. If you are in a government job, basically, you cannot be a member of the Electoral College. And then exactly how all of it worked got changed because they realized very quickly that the way they'd originally established it didn't work. And within 3 elections, almost like half of Section 1 had been changed.
That was like the 12th Amendment, I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
I remember.
The Congress may determine the time of choosing the electors, and the day on which they shall give their votes, which day shall be the same throughout the United States. It's basically, there will be a determined election day.
And here's the difference. Here, the senators and the representatives can be born foreigners, but the president cannot.
Yeah. The president has to be, oh, cheerful phrasing, a natural-born citizen. Now, the important thing to notice here is that that's not defined. Clearly, that means somebody who is a citizen at the time of their birth. But there have been multiple elections where exactly what constitutes natural born has been a matter of intense conversation, and the courts have technically never clarified that. We'll pick a relatively non-controversial example. John McCain. John McCain was born to 2 American parents in Panama. His father was, at the time of his birth, stationed in the Panama Canal Zone. I believe he was born in an actual Panamanian hospital, but either way, certainly he was not born within the borders of the United States.
But wasn't at the time Panama technically United States territory at the time?
Well, the Canal Zone was.
All
right. The entire country was its own country. But the area immediately around the Panama Canal was a possession of the United States until relatively within my lifetime. And obviously John McCain was older than I am. So at the time that he was born, Panama was its own country, but the Panama Canal Zone was American held. But does that mean that he was a natural-born citizen? Well, that depends on who you ask. Another, and when I say uncontroversial, I want to make it very, very clear that I'm just talking about the circumstances of his birth and not his politics. But another uncontroversial person to bring up in this context is Barry Goldwater. Notoriously of the slogan, "In your heart, you know he's right," to which the response was, yes, far right. But he was born in what would become the state of Arizona. What is now the state of Arizona. What was at the time not a state.
A territory?
It was a territory. It was the territory of Arizona. Now, it was an American territory, and became an American state. Does that mean that he was a natural-born citizen? Well, probably. But at the time, that was not really a concept that was in anybody's mind. Congress eventually passed a declaration saying that he was eligible to become president, But if somebody had challenged it to the courts, it's theoretically possible that he could have been declared not a natural-born citizen by purposes of the Constitution. I always thought it was pretty clear that the reason people were arguing about whether or not Barack Obama, the child of an American citizen mother, was really a citizen, whether he was born in Kenya or not, while nobody was talking about how McCain was arguably not a citizen based on the place that even he admitted he was born, kind of had one explanation of why we were having one conversation and not the other. And that reason started with an R and rhymed with acism. But, natural born. Now, of course, there is an out here, because technically, I forget who our first president born a citizen of the United States was, but it might have been Martin Van Buren. It was a while, either way.
Because everyone else was born as a citizen of the British government, because
Technically a subject, because people born in the UK are not citizens, they are subjects. But yeah, a citizen of the United States at the time of the adoption of this Constitution. Because until 1789, there was no such thing as a citizen of the United States. Which means, theoretically, for 35 years, there would be no president because literally no one was eligible.
I always thought that it was awkward when between Obama and Trump, when the former president has to introduce the new future president to the House, and like they had to be nice to each other, because
that was
after 8 years of saying you're not the citizen, like hi, how are you doing, new elected president?
Yeah, things were really touch and go during that, and Trump didn't want him to introduce him to the White House. It was, like, Obama is in some ways a better person than I am, and was willing to be gracious and dignified, and Trump didn't care. So, yeah, a lot happened then. But there have been unambiguous cases of ambiguity, if you will, where there is no dispute that, that's a poser, all right.
The same thing happened when he was leaving office. The president who he quote claims stole the election.
Yeah, as I recall, he just bailed and wasn't there for that, which is fine, because it's not like Biden didn't know his way around the White House.
Yeah. Oh, and Beat says, it was Martin Van Buren who surprisingly spoke Dutch as a child.
He did, in fact, because up until about World War I, there were still parts of the country where it was possible to have a European language that was not English as your native language, because that's what everyone in that town spoke. A lot of places in the Midwest and the Great Plains were German and Scandinavian languages. But yeah,
and finally, last thing I think is next thing is about the removal of office or dying.
Mm-hmm. Which
another blue one.
Blue text. And then the president will get paid.
They even get paid after they leave office too.
There is a pension. That is not actually established by the Constitution. That is established by federal law. Because Ulysses S. Grant died desperately poor. Because Ulysses S. Grant was many things, and one of them was bad with money. And as he was dying of, like, throat cancer or something ungodly painful like that, Mark Twain helped him write his autobiography so that Grant's family wouldn't be destitute when he died. And that is why we have presidential pensions today.
And finally, the last thing it says, will they have to be sworn in by the Chief Justice? I do solemnly swear or affirm that I will faithfully execute the office of the President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
Two things. Number one, it's not the Chief Justice. It can be anyone.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that.
Yeah, Calvin Coolidge was sworn in by his own father. Only president to have been sworn in by his own father. Because he was on vacation at the time. And, Lyndon Johnson, was sworn in by, a judge they grabbed in Texas because he refused to leave Texas until he'd been sworn in. Traditionally, it is the Chief Justice, and certainly if the president becomes president on Inauguration Day, it is the Chief Justice. But over the years, there have been more than a few who were sworn in by someone else simply because circumstances were complicated.
And Bede says, yuck, Calvin Coolidge.
Yeah, well, I'm not exactly his biggest fan either, but it is an interesting historical footnote that he was sworn in by his own dad, who is, I believe, a justice of the peace. Section 2, president is officially in charge of the military.
But they can't declare war.
Right.
You're in charge of it, but you can send troops to the places, but it's not officially a war unless Congress says so.
And this basically establishes the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He may require the opinion in writing of the principal officer in each of the executive departments, is basically the cabinet. He has the power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, which means only federal crimes. For people who want to know why, for example, Biden is not just pardoning everyone with a marijuana record, it's because legally he can't. Because most of those are state crimes. But he can't pardon in the case of impeachment. He can make treaties, provided the senators agree with him. Note it's just the senators.
He can pardon impeachments?
He cannot pardon impeachments.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Shall have power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except in cases of impeachment.
So, if he was vice president, became president after and Obama was impeached, then he can go around like, you're pardoned.
Yeah. Yeah. Any federal crimes that Obama was convicted of, or to use a non-hypothetical example, when Gerald Ford became president, he pardoned Nixon for, any federal crimes that Nixon might have committed. But if Nixon had been impeached instead and removed from office, which everyone was very, very clear that they had the numbers to remove Nixon from office, but if he had gone through with it and been impeached and removed from office, Gerald Ford could not have pardoned him from that impeachment. So
that's why he quit first.
It's a lot of why he quit first. He was not going to stick around to be removed from office.
You think that would have been the only president we ever had impeached that would have actually got kicked out?
Oh yeah, no. There are interviews from the time with Republican congressmen who were very, very clear that they would have removed him from office. He did not have the numbers he needed to prevent a supermajority. It was just going to happen, and everyone knew it.
I guess the next one is about how they had to give the State of the Union address.
Yep. Give a State of Union address. any extraordinary other speeches, receive ambassadors. Basically, this is what the job of president means.
Oh, we skipped the one part of two where the president appointed stuff like future justices and stuff and other offices
to be approved by the Senate because they're the ones who are really important.
And thus it ends up the fun power of presidential appointing judges and Congress like nope.
Yep. Yeah.
I love the double standard they had in the last two elections where the first day when Obama was leaving office, like, oh, we can't appoint a justice during the election year, and the next when Trump was leaving office, let's get all these people appointed.
What do you mean? There's only 3 hours until the election. We could still appoint somebody. Yeah. Yeah.
Nice double standards.
Yeah, and he can fill vacancies that happen during the recess of the Senate. And then he, too, is subject to removal from office for treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. So, reasons. What are high crimes and misdemeanors? Nah, doesn't say.
Like I said, it's big, but it's not as big as the first one. Only 4.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which brings us to the judges, which only have 3.
Yeah. Supreme Court. We should have one of those. Also some other courts. Courts are a good idea. And this is the power of the judiciary. The interesting thing about Article 3 is that the most commonly thought of power of the Supreme Court isn't in it.
What it means to be what the laws mean and stuff.
Yeah, well, to say whether laws are constitutional or not. That is not technically a power of the Supreme Court.
Like the most recently abortion overthrowing thing.
Yeah. In 1804, I want to say, the Marbury versus Madison case is the one where the Supreme Court was like, it is up to the Supreme Court whether things are actually constitutional or not. And it makes sense for them to have that power, but it is not actually a constitutionally mandated power. It's one that they decided they should have because somebody should, and it seemed like their job.
So why, with the justice people so important, they need their own section of the Constitution?
Well, it's very much the idea of the separation of powers, which is one of those, like, junior high kind of phrases where everybody learns it, but maybe what it means doesn't 100% stick. But it's basically, I'm going to use the phrase again, the Founding Fathers thought that it was important that everyone have somebody who can tell them no. And nobody have full power. And they had seen what could happen. This is a universal they had seen because it's, English case law from the time is a lot. But they seen what happened if the executive or the legislature had control over the court. And they firmly believed that the courts needed to be independent, which, I've said a lot that you can tell that they considered the Senate to be the most important power in Congress because 6-year term. And it's true that Supreme Court justices are for life, but that was in theory so that they weren't beholden to political interests. In practice, not so much. I have seen that front line of Hudson Thomas's. Thank you very much. But the theory here, the problem is that there's just a little bit too much idealism in the Constitution in the wrong places. There's a lot of, well, but nobody would do that. And then along comes somebody who absolutely would. But the thing with the Supreme Court is it was very, very clear that there needed to be one court that was on top, controlling everything. Everything went through that court because there needed to be a final say. Because without a Supreme Court, theoretically, things could be in the courts forever. And it was whoever had the money to pay the lawyers longest wins. Supreme Court's at the top. Supreme Court is the last say in how law works in this country. And you'll notice that Section 2 makes it clear that things like cases affecting ambassadors, cases, controversies to which the United States shall be a partner, controversies between two or more states, between citizens of different states. Like, a lot of federal law has to be done not in a state court, but in a court that's above the state courts, that is separate from the states. Because otherwise, let's say that I sued somebody in Idaho. Well, where the lawsuit is held is going to influence who's got the home field advantage, basically. And so the idea of a federal court cuts off the power of the states in that specific way and makes the power more balanced.
Yeah, and then we can actually talk about at least two or three of the more controversial issues, like the Dred Scott case.
Oh, yeah.
We're like, you're not a citizen, you're a property, so you don't get to...
Yeah, well, no black person... Dred Scott found that basically no black people have rights that any white person is bound to respect. That is not subtext, that is text. Because Tawny was a terrible person. I maintain that actually if you read where Roberts falls on a lot of decisions, it is very, very clear that he wakes up in a cold sweat at night sometimes, being seen by history as being the next Tawny. That
was the guy who voted for that.
Yeah, well, that's the Chief Justice who wrote the Dred Scott decision. And Roberts does not want to be that guy. Roberts is not great in a lot of ways, but he knows the limits that he can push things to as far as conservatism before the entire U.S. is just not putting up with it. Because he has read Dred Scott. Thank you very much.
I think that next one was the one that was overthrown by I forget what exactly it was, but it was overthrown by Brown.
Plessy v. Ferguson.
Yeah.
Plessy v. Ferguson, separate but equal. Yeah. And that's another, the Supreme Court is made up of individuals. How many individuals depends on what era, because if you'll notice, Article 3 doesn't say how many people are going to be on the Supreme Court.
I think they've had more... The
court has been bigger and smaller over the course of the last, 200 and change years. There are also, if you'll note, no qualifications for being a Supreme Court justice. The Constitution does not say what you have to do.
The president and the Congress likes you, you're in.
Yeah.
I think the thing they didn't when they overthrew it, and they realized, hey, this isn't equal at all. The other side has a terrible school board.
Basically, Brown versus Board of Education found that separate but equal isn't
equal at all.
Yeah. Yeah. Separate but equal is just separate. Interestingly, one of the people who filed an amicus brief with the Supreme Court, was my historical nemesis, Dr. Frederick Wortham. who did very, very good work about the dangers that segregation posed to children and the effects of racism and all of these things, and also wrote, and this is why he's my nemesis, a book called Seduction of the Innocent, which is about the evils of comic books. I have written it was years ago, but I wrote a full examination where I went through every single chapter of it, giving that its own article, examining exactly everything that is wrong with Seduction of the Innocent. Spoiler, it's a lot. A lot is wrong.
Basically, he's one of those people who are like Pokemon and My Little Pony of the Devil.
Mm-hmm. And he came at it from the best of intentions. But his research is terrible. He just such a bad book. Such a bad book. And I will shoot you the link, and if you want to post it, because I don't really have access to the comments.
Cool, yeah. Just send to me on Discord, and I'll post it.
I will send you the link to my series on Discord, and because it's a tag, it's in reverse chronological order, but that is my series about Seduction of the Innocent, which lasted quite a long time with me. I think I said 5 good things about it. But he was also one of the people who filed a brief with the Supreme Court saying separate but equal is an inherently damaging system. So much as I hate the man, that is one thing he did really, really well. He's the one who did the test where he gave black dolls and white dolls to kids and showed that all children at the time inherently preferred the white doll and thought of it as better. And that was a result of segregation and separate but equal. So he did really good work there. Shame about the rest of his career.
And finally, trials of all crimes, except for impeachment, are by jury.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Impeachment technically has a jury if you think about it. It's just that it's a jury of the number of states times 2, because it's the senators.
Finally, something about treason.
Yeah, treason is only levying war against the United States, against them, you'll note. It's referring to the United States as plural. Or in adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort. No person shall be convicted of treason unless on the testimony of 2 witnesses to the same overt act, or on confession in open court.
Yeah, like you said, unlike the legislative branch and maybe executive branch, the justice is pretty much simple.
The justice is really simple. They all had the same basic mental image of what a court looked like. And so they don't have to go into the same exhaustive detail of what a court will look like, because everybody knew.
Alright.
And that's why the running joke with one of my friends is that my cat is technically constitutionally eligible to be a Supreme Court justice.
Well, if a cat can be elected mayor of a city or state, then pretty much the cat.
And he would not be more corrupt than some of the justices that we have and have had. Though I will say his decisions would all be meow.
Like, every person that has a right to a dead bird on their plates.
Mm-hmm. Everyone should have scritchies and be allowed outside.
I'm sure the Bird Congress would veto that.
Yeah. Though to be fair, my cat is also scared of deer, so he's a lot less excited about being outside right now. Deer are big. He doesn't trust them.
I'd probably have one if I was allergic to cats, I think. Or cats.
Yeah.
I didn't know I was until I was at my niece's house, and I was playing other kittens, and like,
Mhm.
are you look red? I'm like, I do.
Yeah.
Found out.
Um.
At number 4.
Uh. Congress has to keep records of things. All of the actions of Congress have to be above board.
I'm sure that's never
Um.
been anything.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's why we have things like C-SPAN. That is tied to Article 4, Section 1. Is look, here is your government at work. Isn't it boring? Except when it's terrifying. Um. Section 2. Um. Your rights in one state are the same as your rights in other states, which, that's,
Oh,
that's,
iffy nowadays.
yeah, always has been, really. And the establishment of, extradition between states being required. And then the blue part, we're back to person held to service or labor. Basically, it's saying that you gotta return escaped slaves. Which no longer applies.
It's funny how they had to I think it was they had to get 2 or 3 different laws about that later on because no one was following it.
Yeah, the Fugitive Slave Act, and the more the southern states fought to have it enforced, the less happy they made the free states. So, um,
The admission of new states.
the admission of new states, and how you can't just make states out of bits of other states except West Virginia, which, was during the Civil War, so what do? All the people who would have objected to the existence of West Virginia were in rebellion. And Congress can control their territory. Section 4, the U.S. has to protect the states. They've got to make sure that every state has a state government and protect against invasion.
And basically, again, pretty simple.
Yeah. We're getting into stuff where they're like, yeah, this is pretty much it.
This one we talked a little bit about in the last episode, but
yeah, like, they knew what they wanted this part of things to look like. They wanted Article 5. They wanted there to be amendments.
Because even then they knew everything we wrote in here. This might not be good in a few years.
Yeah. Though you'll note, provided that no amendment which may be made prior to the year 1808 shall in any manner affect the first and fourth clauses in the 9th section of the first article. Basically, you can't have a constitutional amendment against slavery before 1808.
And they didn't, not until 60 years later.
Yep. Article 6, the U.S. still has the debts that they garnered during the Revolution and under the Articles of Confederation.
Like, that would bankrupt. No bankruptcy, don't start over from scratch again. Like, the last 4 years, last 15 years didn't count.
Yeah. Well, the thing is that was one of the real problems with the Article of Confederation was the United States had taken on a lot of debt during the Revolution, which the government under the Articles of Confederation was required to pay, despite having absolutely no way of raising any income.
Like again, because all 13 states had to redo it.
Right. So, basically this is saying, yes, okay, we'll pay that. And the Constitution is in charge. It is the supreme law of the United States.
paid that back? Are we still in debt? Have we paid that back yet? Or
I think we officially paid all of our Revolutionary War debt, but the thing is the United States debt has been a constant thing for almost the entire history of the country. So what any specific debt that we have is, yeah, well, not to mention that some of the countries that we owe debts to don't exist anymore or have undergone multiple changes of government of their own, and yeah. Like, if we owed money to France, who would we owe the money to?
yeah, France has a little bit has had a little bit of government changes since the revolution.
A little bit. France was undergoing some times of their own in 1789.
Like, and like in 1789, Prussia was a thing, and now it's Germany.
Yeah, there was a lot happening, and yeah. And here's a clause that doesn't get paid attention to in certain circles very much. No religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. Legally, constitutionally, you can hold any damn office in this country you want to, regardless of your religion or lack thereof. There are people who don't believe that. There are people who have enshrined in state laws religious tests. But those laws are legally invalid because the Constitution, by Article 6, is the supreme law of the land, and by Article 6, forbids religious tests. They have to be bound by oath or affirmation. They have to pinky swear that they'll uphold the Constitution, but they can't, George Washington swore his oath of office on a Bible and said, "So help me God." But that is tradition. And we read the oath of office, and "So help me God" isn't in it. And the idea of swearing on a Bible isn't in it.
Just like
legally.
Just like the Pledge of Allegiance add "under God" later on.
Yeah. Yeah. In my mother's lifetime. Which I've pointed out to a few people who insist that our parents as children said the Pledge of Allegiance. It's like, well, my mom as a child did not always say "under God." So, yeah. Also, the only U.S. president who's tried to get "In God We Trust" off U.S. currency was Theodore Roosevelt, who thought it was blasphemous.
And finally, Article 7,
And
how to get this thing approved.
yeah.
Only 9 states.
Well, they only needed to have 9 in order for it to be official and formal.
They need the other ones to agree to just because.
Well, in order to be part of the country, you had to ratify the Constitution, but in order for the Constitution to be considered valid, they only needed 9, which was it was another one of those compromises. Like, it was there to kind of push the last few states that didn't really want to.
So what's 9 with the what's 9? At least 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So what's 9 were the first ones that became part of the country?
Oh gosh, I'd have to look that up. Give me just a second here. That is not a fact that I have memorized. As you may have noticed, I have a lot of facts memorized. That's not one of them. Timeline of drafting and ratification of the United States Constitution. Yes, that will work nicely. And I can just scroll forward to 1789, because... Okay, so... it was Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Georgia, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Maryland, South Carolina, New Hampshire. So with New Hampshire, officially that's 9 states.
So that was the country, and the other four
Mm-hmm.
came up later.
Then Virginia and New York are the two most important of the ones that are left, arguably. North Carolina, and in 1790, Rhode Island.
Rhode Island held the longest.
Yep. Officially, it was the government existed as of 1789. It was written in 1787, officially took effect in 1789. And well after everything had been going on, the Supreme Court had already convened by the time Rhode Island ratified it.
So basically, Rhode Island was part of the country until then.
Mm-hmm. Less than a year later, we had a 14th state, Vermont. So, yeah. The Bill of Rights had been proposed already.
You think that's what Rhode Island was holding out for?
I mean, that was part of it, honestly. A lot of the debate in ratifying the Constitution had to do with the concept of a Bill of Rights, which the original argument had been that it didn't need, because any right specifically mentioned might suggest to people that other rights didn't exist.
Which I guess they didn't.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the concept of a right to privacy is not enshrined in the Constitution officially and formally, but it is generally held to exist based on other things that are in the Constitution and in the Bill of Rights. But the idea that it doesn't exist because it's not specifically mentioned is one of the reasons that there wasn't initially a Bill of Rights.
So, does anybody in the chat right now have any questions for our esteemed guest, whatever the word is? Oh wait! You said you're a freelance writer?
Yeah. I write for a volunteer film website called the Solute, Solute. It's a terrible name. I voted for something else. I write an average of 4 articles a week. Today I wrote about unions in film history and mostly on screen. I also mostly do the obituaries, which I will say I've just found out that I have to write an obituary today because Tina Turner has just died.
Another celebrity bites the dust.
I mean, she's not a young woman.
These have been very bad years for celebrities.
Yeah, well, I wrote an article a few years back about how, really, yes, 2016 was that bad a year in celebrity deaths. We really did have that many.
Like, what was the year that both Carrie Fisher and her mom died at the same time?
Oh, I'd have to look that up, and I write a column on Sundays called Celebrating the Living, and I'd already covered Debbie Reynolds, but I had not yet gotten to Carrie Fisher. So,
Yeah. So you're not a good co-writer for for science fiction then?
I some science fiction.
Because I'm trying to write this novel and I'm stuck right now. So So I
No,
know.
I get that, but
Yeah.
yeah, 2016.
So that was
That was that was a bad year. That was a lot that year. Um,
let's see. I don't know if it's a question or not, but Bede says based and union piled.
uh,
But anyways, yeah, what do you have coming up on your don't do anything on your own channel, but what's coming up in your future?
let's see. I'll be writing about the Goofy cartoon How to Dance for Friday. Um, Sunday, I'm continuing a series of Deep Space Nine themed articles with an examination of Terry Farrell, who is Jadzia Dax for Deep Space Nine. And then I'm taking a break from my Deep Space Nine articles because I always do Pride for June, and so I've got people like Fanny Flagg and Alan Cumming. And then getting back to Deep Space Nine in July with Cole Meany, who, to my knowledge, is not eligible for Pride.
Oh, funny fact, fun fact about Deep Space Nine. That was the only ever Star Trek series that I watched from beginning to end when it originally aired.
I've actually done that for any because at the time that Next Generation debuted, it was after my bedtime.
Well, so it was after mine too, but I keep me from when I was sticking out at my TV at sticking out my TV. I first watching DS9. I first started watching TGNG in eighth grade, but it's already in the fifth season.
It
And
was, I think, it was about there for me. Maybe about second or third. I'd have to look it up exactly, but about then, yeah. But I went through a few years in the Deep Space Nine and Voyager years without regular access to TV, so
yeah, and then I watched all of DS9, and then Voyager. I stopped watching sometime after 7 and 9 joined. I don't know, I just got bored or whatever, and stopped watching it then.
I will be getting to a Voyager tribute in a couple of years, but I've got to reconfigure some things because I realized I've already written about Kate Mulgrew. So
And I didn't watch Enterprise till years after it aired.
I watched some Enterprise because I really like Scott Bakula, but it turns out I don't like Scott Bakula that much.
And of course, I didn't watch the original series because I wasn't born yet.
Right, likewise, likewise.
And I didn't even know about the first few years of TNG until later on.
Literally, I remember being angry because I was sent to bed rather than being allowed to stay up to watch Encounter at Farpoint. So,
I think I would have been 6 or 7 when that originally aired. So I probably too young to watch it then.
um, I would have been. I think I was in fourth grade, 1987. So yeah, I would have been just shy of my 11th birthday when Next Generation
Yeah, 7.
debuted.
I was 7 in '87. So yeah,
Yeah,
I think first or second or third grade then.
yeah. And my older sister could stay up and watch it, and I couldn't, and I was mad. That's what I can tell you about the premiere of Next Generation.
Okay. Well, as for me, this Saturday, Bede will be back on my channel to talk about his favorite French kings. And
That should be
unlike
hot.
England, they had no queens.
Yeah, Salic Law.
But he'll talk about more about the Salic Law this coming up this Saturday. But until then, never stop learning. Enjoy the randomness. We'll see you next time.